Welcome everyone to today's session on discussion of U.S.-China engagement, past achievements, and future adjustments. This webinar is hosted by the Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament and the Carter Center, and it's generously supported by the United States Heartland China Association, the National Association of Chinese Americans, the China Research Center, the American China Public Affairs Institute, the CGTN think tank, and the Ford Foundation. These organizations collectively represent a wide range of Chinese and American perspectives and represent hundreds of collective years of commitment to strengthening the bilateral U.S.-China relationship. All are aware that this important relationship is in a moment of significant transition, and that it is more important than ever for people on all sides to honestly share their views and openly listen to different perspectives. And that is what we hope to do today. Over the past few days, the Biden White House framed the U.S.-China relationship as competitive and stated that the U.S. will approach its relationship with China with strategic patience and in a multilateral context. Also this week, Chinese leaders emphasized the global benefits of cooperation while also underscoring the power of multilateralism. As the United States and China begin to define the parameters of their relationship going forward, the world is facing significant economic and public health challenges brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic, while also facing a range of issues resulting from geopolitical power shifts and the growing impacts of climate change. There could be no better time for the conversation we're about to have. I'm Elizabeth Knupp, the director of the Ford Foundation's office in China, and I will be one of today's moderators. We'll begin with opening remarks by our hosts and followed by keynote addresses from two ambassadors. We will then have a robust panel discussion with 6 experts on multiple dimensions of the U.S.-China relationship. Before we start, just a few housekeeping items. Our Zoom room holds 500 people. We're also, as you saw in the chat, live streaming this event on YouTube in case you know some people who can't get into the Zoom room. And everyone who has registered will receive a link to a recording after the session. We're going to have about 20 to 30 minutes for Q&A at the end of the panel discussion. So throughout this morning, please submit your questions either in the chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to make sure that your questions are answered. All the listeners today have received bios for all of the speakers. So when I make introductions, I am not going to linger on the extensive achievements of each person. That would take up all of our time. Suffice it to say that each person brings a deep personal commitment to understanding the U.S.-China relationship and extensive professional engagement across government, academia, civil society, and business. We will have a very comprehensive discussion. So without further ado, I want to introduce the first session in which we will first invite Ms. Barbara Smith, Vice President for Peace Programs at the Carter Center, and Tao Tao, the Deputy Secretary General at the Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament, to make opening remarks. They will be followed by our 2 keynote speakers, Ambassador Max Baucus, former U.S. Ambassador to China, and Cui Tiankai, the current Chinese Ambassador to the U.S. So I'm now going to turn it over to Barbara.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's a great pleasure to be here at this virtual dialogue on U.S.-China engagement, past achievements, and future adjustments. This is the 9th time the Carter Center is also working to organize such a forum on U.S.-China relations. The first one, of course, was held in Beijing in December 2012 when President Carter visited China right after the 18th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. The second one was then held in the U.S. in Atlanta in 2013, with Ambassador Cui Tiankai having arrived in D.C. not too long before that meeting. And you came and gave one of the keynote speeches at that meeting. The third one was held in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing in September 2014 during President Carter's last visit to China. Ambassador Max Baucus came to that meeting to deliver opening remarks, and you also very graciously hosted President and Mrs. Carter at your residence in Beijing. And in January 2019, the Carter Center organized a 3-day meeting to commemorate the 40th anniversary of normalization. Ambassador Cui came again and spoke, and Craig Allen and Elizabeth, you were also there and spoke at that meeting. This is my first time attending this meeting, but I know you all to be friends of the Carter Center, and more importantly, you are significant players in this bilateral relationship and instrumental caretakers of that relationship. Ambassador Chu Bunchong visited Atlanta many times when he was China's ambassador to the US, and Vice Minister Long Yun-tu interviewed President Carter when the latter was attending the unveiling of the statue for General Claire Junot 10 years ago in Xinjiang, Hunan province. In May 2015, Professor David Lampton, who is at the board of the Asia Foundation when I was there as well, gave his famous tipping point speech. And Professor Chu Feng came to the Carter Center in Atlanta many times. And Daniel Wright and Elizabeth both used to be where Chu Feng is now, running Johns Hopkins Center at Nanjing University. The Carter Center is honored to have the virtual presence of this esteemed group of movers and shakers of the bilateral relationship. President and Mrs. Carter asked me to convey his best regards to all of you. He also wrote a letter to all participants and attendees of this virtual dialogue. He was also not able to attend the inauguration of President Biden a week ago, but he wrote a letter to wish him all the success and asked him specifically to stabilize a bilateral relationship between US and China. 42 years ago this month, the US and the People's Republic of China recognized each other after 30 years of alienation and hostility. President Carter likes to say that that decision has changed the US, China, and the world. The challenge we are facing is that people on both sides of the Pacific now have different views of the meaning and significance of those changes brought about by the joint decision by President Carter and Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping. The goal of today's meeting is to look at how the changes unleashed by the coming together of our two great nations have contributed to the longest period of peace and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region, and examine ways that the positive factors of US-China interaction could be protected and sustained. It is the responsibility of the leaders of both countries and the hopes of two peoples who have benefited so much from this relationship. The Carter Center will continue to be the bridge of the two countries and is willing to work with all partners to identify, design, and implement projects of bilateral cooperation. I would like to let all participants and attendees also know that the Carter Center will soon release a report called Keeping the United States and China Engaged, the Role of Civil Society and NGOs. It will be electronically delivered to all of those who have signed up for today's meeting. I would also like to thank Dr. Cao Cao and the Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament for working together with us to organize this meeting. I would also like to thank all of our sponsors, many of whom have already been mentioned by Elizabeth, particularly the Ford Foundation, for their support to the Carter Center. I won't go into that in more detail. Information about the sponsors is in the program for the dialogue. And it is now my great privilege to read President Carter's letter to the participants and attendees of this meeting. Rosalind joins me in welcoming you to the Joint People's Association for Peace and Disarmament and the Carter Center virtual meeting to address what U.S.-China engagement has achieved in the past, what needs to be done to sustain future U.S.-China engagement. 42 years ago, when Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping and I announced our decision to establish full diplomatic relations between the U.S. and the People's Republic of China, we knew that we were opening an era of opportunity for both nations. I am proud to have witnessed the benefits that followed, including peace in Asia, expanded bilateral trade and investment, and a prosperous friendship between the American and Chinese people. Yet the relationship is under significant strain. In recent years, government officials in both countries have adopted rhetoric and policies that reflect the hostility that Vice Premier Deng and I sought to calm back in 1978. Opinion leaders in China complain that the US government is interested in a regime change in China, and US government officials have perceived the rise of China as a threat to American national security and global order. The trade war between our two countries remains protracted, and a critical lack of dialogue persists. Nonetheless, the United States and China are and must remain closely connected. The Chinese people continue to consume billions of dollars in American agricultural products. America buys vast quantities of Chinese manufactured goods each year, and our interests frequently overlap in the developing world and in the fight against climate change. Despite challenges between our governments, I am confident that both American and Chinese people desire peace and prosperity over conflict. Together, they can call on their respective leaders to abandon zero-sum rivalry and to instead restore trust, respect, and normalcy between our two nations. We are pleased Ambassador Cui Qingkai and many prominent Chinese and American managers of bilateral relationships are at today's meeting, and we send our best wishes for a productive meeting. Sincerely, Jimmy Carter. Thank you. And thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Barbara. And really, it's so wonderful to have those remarks from President Carter. We wish him well, and they really set an important frame for the rest of today's discussion. So thank you for sharing that. I now want to turn to Dr. Tao for his opening remarks. Dr. Tao, would you like to speak? So, I think he's coming in somewhere else. Let's give him 1 second to link.
Yeah, maybe we'll have Ambassador Baucus to speak first.
Okay, that would be great. Ambassador Baucus, would you like to go? And Ambassador, okay. Yep, there you are. Good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is a very high honor, especially under the auspices of President Carter. I've known him for 40 years. I don't know anyone who has dedicated himself or herself more to peace and understanding than President Carter. I'm a big admirer of President Carter. He's an amazing man. I also very much want to thank and acknowledge two ambassador friends of mine, Ambassador Joe, Ambassador Cui. I invited both Ambassador Joe when I was in the U.S. Senate, Ambassador Cui Qingkai when I was in the Senate, to my home state of Montana. And I showed them around Montana. They learned a bit about Montana. Montana's learned a bit about him. Also, when I was in the Senate, invited Zhang Yusui, once ambassador of China to the U.S., as well as Yang Zhichur. And they've been friends ever since. But Ambassador Cui, good seeing you, and Ambassador Joe, thank you both so very, very much. I'm supposed to be brief here, and I will be, so I'll try to get straight to the point. I'm very excited for the relationship 2021 and going forward. Sure, the relationship has deteriorated a little bit in the last several years, but with the election of President Biden, although there will be lots of tension between the two countries, I think we've hit bottom, and we're going to start to rise and put things back together again. A couple of incidents that might be instructive when I was serving as ambassador. One is about the importance of Hong Kong to China at the President Obama, President Xi's summit. Ambassador Cui Qingkai was there in 2014. It's very interesting to me. The one item that's very much under President Xi's skin was Hong Kong. You see, well, you Americans, you're fomenting unrest down there in Hong Kong. And President Biden and President Obama would say, oh, no, we're not doing that. But you could tell that was one matter it meant a lot to President Xi, and I think we should. That was instructive to me as respect to China's policy, respect to Hong Kong, and I think we should very much respect it. I also learned when I was serving the importance of the United States working with its allies. The example I have is something called a proposed banking regulation about 2014, where the Chinese government said that all Chinese banks had to have about 70% of domestic content by about the year 2018. All vendors had to turn over source code, backdoor, you name it, which is obviously anathema to American companies because they didn't want to live up to those restrictions. Well, as it turned out, that was one time where the United States worked with U.S. Chamber of Commerce, U.S. China Business Council, also with the European Commission, European Chamber of Commerce, and Kedenran in Japan and South Korea, business people. And guess what? That's the one time in my experience where China backed off. They did not enact that proposed banking regulation because all Western countries, Japan and South Korea, worked together and wrote the same very strong message, letters to China. You can't do that. It's my best example when I was serving how working together really does work. Another incident, which I think is quite illustrative to me, is during the South China Sea. Clearly, China was dumping sand on submerged reefs, making islands and so forth. And being honest about it, there wasn't much anybody could do about it. China claimed under the 9-dash line, that's theirs. Other countries had claims. My argument to China was, hey, other countries have claims that this should be moderated. But no. It was China's. China didn't want to even discuss it. So what did we do? When President Xi was visiting Washington, D.C., summit with President Obama, we were quite concerned that China is going to militarize Scarborough Shoal just off the Philippines. Very concerned. And I, at a lunch with Ash Carter, the others there, Secretary of Defense, just said, Ash, here's what we have to do. President Obama should look President Xi straight in the eye, as few people in the room as possible, privately, not broadcasted, not public. Look him straight in the eye and said, you're not going there. You're not going to Scarborough Shoal. You're not going to militarize. Because if you militarize Scarborough Shoal, you'll pay irreparable, immense consequences. You'll rue the day you did it. I'm not going to tell you what they are, but you'll rue the day you did it. So that's exactly what happened. President Obama said that, President Xi, there were only 6 people in the room, including President Obama, and it worked. China did not militarize Scarborough Shoal. Now, maybe they weren't going anyway, but to me, it was a lesson, how you got to stand up, be firm, make sure you get the respect of China, as is the case in any relationship. You have to have mutual respect, and you have to stand up to get the respect. If you don't stand up, you're not going to get it. Another lesson to me was going another direction, and that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That, I think, was the most important geopolitical matter across my desk. So important that I will bet beforehand, ambassadors from other countries, Southeast Asian countries, would say to me, Max, you got to pass that. You got to pass TPP. Why, I ask? The answer, because we need it so we can play you Americans off against China. We want to work with both of you. And if you're not here, it's harder for us to work with both the United States and with China. We need it. Well, I did that. I went back to the United States on my own dime. I met with 43 members of Congress 2 months before the election, trying to encourage them to make sure we adopt TPP. It was toxic. Hillary Clinton had deep sixed it. Organized labor was opposed to it. But Donald Trump had deep sixed it. He was opposed to it. My lesson to me there was that local politics in America was so dominant, so powerful. Organized labor was so opposed to TPP. The lesson for me being, obviously, the importance of local politics in America and in China. And add to that, it's going to be difficult, I think, for the Biden administration to get back into TPP. They're going to have to work with organized labor and with the perceived job loss, the result of trade agreements. Now, obviously, China's done a great job with RCEP, and with its agreement with the EU. And we Americans clearly have to get much more involved. And in this case, we're talking more about involvement in Asia. And rejoining the new version of TPP is just one way we need to do that. I also think this may be a bit strong, but I think the Chinese recognize strength than do any other people. And they can smell weakness better than any other people. So much of this comes down to strength. But I said it's mutual respect kind of strength. And I think essentially both countries do want to work with each other, but there are a couple of things that need to happen. Number one is, as been mentioned, the United States cannot let China think that the United States is trying to in any way stop China's rise. We cannot let there be any hint of that, because if there is, it's going to undermine the relationship, and China's going to double down and decouple. More decoupling will be the rule of the day. On the other hand, China, in my judgment, must show, not just say, but show to the United States and the West that China does not want to be the hegemon in the Indo-Pacific. It wants to work with the United States. They have some accommodation in the South China Sea, for example. But until that happens, until China shows, not just say, because China does a lot of saying, a lot of talking, show with actions and deeds, with actions, then I think it's a chance for the relationship to begin to come better together. Small little experience, I think, is pretty illustrative. It's clear that the Chinese people and the American people have virtually the same interests, hopes, and desires and fears as the other. We're all people. We're all the same. I was at a meeting with Ambassador, with the Secretary Pritzker. Make a long story short, I just threw away my talkers when it came to me, put them aside, and I said, look, everybody. I think Leo Ho was there. Others were there, about 200 people. And I said, I've run 18 times in political office. Nobody else in this room has ever run for office. Nobody. Americans or Chinese. Nobody's faced voters here. And what have I learned in those 18 elections? Two things. One, people have the same hopes, fears, desires. What do they want? All they want is to have a decent income, food on the table, be able to take care of their kids, good education for their kids, clean air, clean water, decent health care, be left alone a little bit, pursue their dream. They're the same. Whether it's in the United States or in China, we're the same. And guess what? I was stunned. I got big smiles, spontaneous applause from the Chinese side. Why? Because I think that they appreciated just mutual respect. Because I was talking, not condescending, not talking down to them, but just, hey, we're all here together. Let's work this out. I think I learned in the United States when I served in the embassy, try to keep this short. We Americans need a long-term strategy with respect to China and a whole government approach to China. We don't have it. It's hard for a democracy to get it. When I was there in the embassy, I was very surprised and saddened, frankly, that when I participate with National Security Council meetings by satellite, the NSC acted ad hoc. We were just reactive. There was no real long-term strategy with respect to China. It was just day to day. We need a strategy, and I think Biden's going to do that. I also learned very much that we, with respect to North Korea, that our North Korean solution must pass through China. When I served, our officials would go over, talk to the Chinese government, talk to President Xi, so they were just checking the box. There was no thoughtful effort going into how we approach North Korea, especially with respect to China. It's got to be much more thoughtful than it has been. I'll finish up by just saying, I think it's a huge opportunity. I think Biden's on the right track. I think he should suggest small steps with China, reopen the consulates, for example. That's not a big deal. Let's start there. Maybe get some journalists back and forth with each other's country. Then work on the global issues. When I was serving in Beijing, I was very impressed with how well our two countries worked together on fighting Ebola. It was amazing. I mean, a lot of meetings, we worked hard together, and China's very much participated with the United States in fighting Ebola in Africa. We should try to find ways to do that here with respect to COVID. There's got to be ways to do that. And add to that is climate, clearly, climate change. One of the proudest moment when I was serving is sitting there working with President Xi and President Obama, and where they agreed to address climate change. It was wonderful. And it's happened in the past. It can happen again when our two countries work together to address climate. So I'll just finish up there by saying that we should be, though mindful of local politics in both our countries, mentioning anything favorable about China in Washington, D.C. today, you get your head chopped off. It's just very, very toxic in D.C. I worked with a small group of Democratic senators who want to be reasonable, get their, do what's right with respect to China. It's almost like we're meeting in a secret room because they're afraid that the word's going to get out too much. But that I think Biden's going to help address that and be much more responsible. I see he's starting to review some of the sanctions that have been posed against China. That's good. But I also think that you'll find the politics of the U.S. to be quite difficult for President Biden. Several U.S. senators want to be president in 2024. A couple of them running for re-election. They're going to be very, very hard on China. That's going to make things difficult for President Biden. The lodestar I have, the bottom line for me is that Joe Biden, who I know, known him 40 years. He came to Montana for my wedding in Montana, by the way. Very good friend. He is a kind of guy who knows what's got to be done, and he does have his head screwed on straight. And I think he's going to be is a good day for the relationship.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Baucus. You put a very complex relationship in a few short minutes, and really appreciate that. But your optimistic view of the Biden administration gives us some hope. I want to now turn to Ambassador Cui, and then I'll ask Dr. Tao to wrap up this opening session with his remarks at the end. So Ambassador Cui, please, over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And good morning to people in China and good evening to people in America. We do have a time difference. There's nothing we can do about that. But I just hope our views are not as different as the time difference. It's so nice to see all of you again, although on the screen. Hopefully we could have a face-to-face meeting very soon. And let me first thank President Carter for his very encouraging and enlightening letter. And as the Chinese New Year is coming, let me wish him and his family every success. It's really my great pleasure to attend this dialogue organized by the Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament and the Carter Center. As we speak, COVID-19 continues to put human society to the test, and the China-US relationship has come to a new crossroads. With the upcoming year of the ox, bringing in confidence and hope, this dialogue is highly relevant and carries special significance. Tomorrow will be the 42nd anniversary of Mr. Deng Xiaoping's visit to the United States. 42 years ago, Mr. Deng and President Carter made the historic decision of establishing diplomatic relations between China and the United States. And our two countries were able to break the ice of the Cold War and rise above ideological differences. Since then, our ever-deepening cooperation has delivered huge benefits to the two peoples and contributed enormously to world peace, stability, and prosperity. Facts have proved that we have made the right choice and stood on the right side of the history. However, in the past few years, some people try to deny these basic facts. By creating rumors, stoking hatred, and fanning confrontation, they attempted to hijack America's China policy and push China-US relations down the precipice of confrontation. This has seriously damaged the fundamental interests of the two peoples and is doomed to failure. Now, there have also been calls recently for America to adjust its strategy and build an allied and partner coalition so as to address what they call China's challenge and restore balance and legitimacy in the Asia-Pacific. I'm afraid such an adjustment is just like putting old wine in a new bottle. It may cause the same mistakes made in the past and create new imbalances, which will further disrupt regional order. At this historical juncture, we are facing a consequential choice again. And I agree with President Carter that China and the United States must remain closely connected and restore trust, respect, and normalcy between them. While China wishes America full success in building unity, in healing, and in restoration, it is also hoped that integrity, candor, respect, and vision will return to its China policy. In his congratulatory message to President Joe Biden, President Xi Jinping pointed out, to promote sound and steady development of China-US relations not only serves the fundamental interests of the Chinese and American peoples, it also meets the expectation of the wider international community. It is hoped that the two sides will follow the spirit of no conflict, no confrontation, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation, so that our two sides may focus on cooperation, manage differences, move forward China-US relations in a sound and steady manner, and together with other countries and the international community, advance the noble cause of world peace and development. We hope that our two countries will work together towards this goal. China and the United States need mutual trust, not misjudgment. Throughout its 100-year history, the Communist Party of China has always upheld its mission to pursue happiness for the people and rejuvenation for the nation. As China enters a new development stage, we will follow a new development philosophy and foster a new development paradigm. We are deepening reform and further opening up. We are striving to eliminate absolute poverty, protect the environment, and address problems resulting from unbalanced and inadequate development. Everything we do is to meet the people's aspiration for a better life, not to challenge or displace any country. And on that, I totally agree with Max. The aspirations of our two peoples are very similar. And we always believe in harmony in diversity between countries and in a community with a shared future for mankind. As President Xi Jinping said in his special address at the World Economic Forum virtual event of the Davos Agenda 2 days ago, countries need to abandon ideological prejudice and jointly follow a path of peaceful coexistence, mutual benefit, and win-win cooperation. Differences in history, culture, and social system do not justify antagonism or confrontation. They should motivate cooperation. It is our firm belief that China and the United States can benefit from the prosperity and development of the other side. We may have competition, but we don't have to be rivals. Instead, we should strive to be partners. America is a great nation, but it would have to ask itself, can it accept the development and prosperity of another nation whose history, culture, and political system is different and live peacefully with it? Taking China as a strategic rival and imaginary enemy would be a huge strategic misjudgment. To develop any policy on the basis of that would only lead to grave strategic mistakes. China and the United States need dialogue, not confrontation. Our two countries have not a small number of differences and disagreements. The only way out of them is candid and equal-footed dialogue on the basis of mutual respect. On specific issues, we should explore solutions acceptable to both sides on the basis of goodwill for goodwill and good faith for good faith. Claiming that dialogue is useless is no less than advocating confrontation. But at the same time, some issues have been raised in China-US relations under the banner of values, but in fact, they all focus on China's territory, so much so that people cannot but question the real intention behind. On issues that concern its sovereignty, reunification, and territorial integrity, China will not back down. And it is hoped that the United States will respect China's core interests and refrain from crossing the red line. China and the United States need cooperation, not fighting. Both China and the United States gain from cooperation and lose from confrontation. Cooperation is the only right option for the two sides. Over the past 2 decades, we have carried out effective coordination and cooperation in a wide range of fields, from overcoming the global financial crisis to fighting terrorism, from helping African countries combat Ebola to addressing hotspots such as the Korean Peninsula issue and the Iranian nuclear issue. It has been proved time and again that when China and the United States cooperate, we can get things done. And that is good news for both countries and the whole world. Right now, we face the common enemy of the pandemic and an increasing threat from climate change. China sincerely welcomes America's return to the Paris Agreement and the World Health Organization, and looks forward to stronger cooperation with it in these two fields. We also urgently need to enhance macroeconomic policy coordination to fend off international economic and financial risks and inject confidence into the world economy. China and the United States need exchanges, not estrangement. It is distressing to see how much damage has been done to our people-to-people exchanges. More and more Chinese students and scholars are questioning if the United States is still an ideal place for education, if academic research can survive political persecution. More and more Chinese tourists are worrying if their visa application would be rejected due to their political belief. And more Chinese companies are wondering if the level playing field touted by the United States truly exists here. However, nothing can sever the friendly ties between the two peoples. Over the past year, I have been much busier than before the pandemic in taking part in various kinds of online meetings and talks. And I was often overwhelmed by the passion from both countries for greater exchanges and mutual understanding. there is no place for McCarthyism in the 21st century, and no one can push the two peoples back to the era of estrangement and isolation. As the poem recited by National Youth Poet Laureate Amanda Gorman at the inauguration ceremony of President Biden goes, "The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light. If only we are brave enough to see it, if only we are brave enough to be it." So let's work together with courage and hope to find light, spread light, and illuminate the future for China-US relations and the mankind. Thank you all. Let me wish this online dialogue a complete success. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Cui. First of all, for quoting Amanda Gorman. Her beautiful poetry is really a perfect way to end your remarks, which were both incredibly framing of the aspiration, but also clear about the challenge. So I really do appreciate those remarks. I want to see if Dr. Tao is able to join now for his remarks. Dr. Tao?
Yes, Elizabeth, can you hear me? Yeah, yes, it's clear now. Hello.
So there seems to be some,
Yeah.
okay,
Yes.
try again. Yeah, okay, good.
I'm very sorry for the cyber connection poor, very poor. Thank you, Chair. Dear distinguished guests, good morning from Beijing. Can you hear? Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
First of all, on behalf of the CPAPD, I'd like to extend our warm welcome to all participating guests and express my sincere appreciation to the Carter Center for organizing this online dialogue with us. Inspired by the presentations of our guests, I'd like to share a few of my observations briefly. At present, the China-US relations are going through a difficult time, facing crucial moments and critical crossroads. We need to gain experience and wisdom from history to promote our bilateral relations in joint efforts. During the past 40+ years, the China-US relations have experienced ups and downs, twists and turns ever since the establishment of diplomatic relations between our two countries. We have achieved historic developments and produced tangible profits to our two peoples. History and reality have proven that cooperation between China and the US will benefit both countries, while conflicts will hurt both. Therefore, cooperation is the right choice and the general direction both countries should persist. China is willing to work with the United States to promote China-US relations based on coordination, stability, and cooperation in the spirit of non-conflict, non-confrontation, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation. As two major powers of unique influence, the China-US relationship is not only the most important bilateral relationship, but also with the deepest integration, the broadest cooperation, and the largest common interests. As Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping once said, although there are various disputes, problems, and differences between China and the United States, relations between our two countries must eventually be improved. The proper management of China-US relations is a noble cause of creating universal peace for future generations. which requires new thinking, new paths, and new measures. We should not view each other as the problem root, but operate this bilateral relationship from the perspective of development. In the best case, this bilateral relationship could become the dynamics for improvement and progress of respective domestic governance in both countries, thus coming out as a better China and a better US in front of the world. At present, China and the United States should work with each other to rebuild the new strategic framework for sound and stable development of China-US relations, promote the new type of competition relations between China and the US, and explore the new model of peaceful coexistence and common evolution among countries with different systems and cultures. In this way, we can achieve power sharing rather than power shifting between China and the United States, which will not only benefit the peoples of both countries, but also peoples of the world. So this is the end of my speech. Thank you for your listening. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Dr. Tao. I really appreciate those remarks. And your remarks bring us to the conclusion of the first section of today's session. Ambassador Baucus has already left. He had another meeting that he had to attend, and I would invite Ambassador Cui to stay as long as he can for the second part of our discussion. But I really want to thank President Carter, the two ambassadors, Dr. Tao and Ms. Smith, for framing up what I think is both a great aspiration and a great challenge at this moment in U.S.-China relations. So it really helps frame up our discussion. So the next session, we're going to dive into what are three key areas in U.S.-China relations that we think are worth and important to explore. The first is our economic and trade relationship. The second is our civic or people-to-people relationship, with Ambassador Cui just mentioned has really been hurt a lot in the most recent years. And also we want to look at mechanisms and approaches for risk management in the relationship going forward. And we're dividing this into three pairs of experts who will explore each issue in turn. So we'll start first on the economic and trade issue, and the pair of experts who will be speaking to us are Craig Allen, President of the U.S.-China Business Council, and Long Yong-tu, who is the former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and the former Secretary General of the Boao Forum for Asia, among other things. And I'm going to ask everybody to try to keep their comments to almost 7 or 8 minutes at the most, so that we can try to have some time for questions and answers at the end of the session. And I might be slightly less friendly on timekeeping as I was with ambassadors, who are allowed to speak as long as they wish. So I'm going to start with Craig. So please, over to you.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. And let me thank the Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament and the Carter Center for putting together this program. It's an honor for me to speak with Long Yong-tu and also the other distinguished panelists here this evening. So in Washington, we have recently seen a transfer of power from one party to another. For the previous 4 years, the United States experimented with populism, tinged with nationalisms, and sometimes an anti-foreigner or anti-elite, anti-institution, and anti-science sentiments. U.S.-China relations have suffered under populism. One of the core tenets of the Trump administration was a false belief that bilateral trade deficits are important and they are caused by the perfidy of the other guy, rather than a macroeconomic imbalance between savings, consumption, and investment. It's unfortunate that the excessive focus on bilateral trade balances obscures the fact that for 245 years of American history, trade and investment has been a cornerstone of our prosperity. Trade and investment with China is no exception. US-China trade has benefited both countries for 2.5 centuries or even longer. America's populist experiment is, of course, associated with Donald Trump, but the fundamental problems associated with populism are much deeper. First, populism is seen everywhere in the world, and it concerns the structure of the social contract and very rapid changes in technology and society. So with the election, some things have changed and some things have not. In the recent election, both the White House and the Senate have changed hands, leaving all Congress and the White House in the hands of the Democratic Party. Now, this is a big change. Much about our governance will change, but we should not exaggerate or raise expectations unreasonably. Polarization has not changed. COVID has not changed. Geopolitics has not changed. Neither budgets nor trade deficits have changed. Technology competition with China has not changed. And China's policies greeting the Biden administration has not changed, at least yet. Also, we must remind ourselves that public perceptions in the United States about China are very poor. And similarly, public perceptions about the United States in China are low. Further, in the United States, the new administration will have to negotiate with Congress, which, while it's controlled by the Democrats, remains very skeptical of China. I expect lots of China-oriented legislation in 2021. In addition, the remnants of the Trump administration are happy to criticize President Biden if he is to make any major moves with regard to China. Now, the Biden administration has put in a very strong team of national security, foreign affairs, and trade experts. The entire senior team is very pragmatic, principled, and deeply knowledgeable about China. But they face a very skeptical public and a skeptical Congress. On the general subject of trade, the Democratic Party is very divided. President Biden has made it clear that trade agreements are not his top priority. His cabinet members have said that they will keep the tariffs in place for the time being. So let us recall that the Democratic Party is made up of a coalition of interests, including labor unions, environmentalists, feminists, youths, ethnic minorities, and progressives. None of these groups are particularly pro-trade, and for the most part, they're anti-global and anti-trade. So the Biden administration will not want to prioritize trade agreements or rush to globalize. Rather, I expect relatively little activity in this field for the near term. However, foreign government leaders are not going to leave him alone. They do want to talk about trade. And thus, the Biden administration will have to make some decisions, even as the president makes introductory calls with foreign leaders this week. So the new team is very realistic. They understand that the economic architecture of Asia has changed with RCEP, with the EU-China investment agreement, and the Belt and Road. They recognize that Xi Jinping was serious when he said China may join the CPTPP. The new team recognizes that the relationship with China will remain competitive, but they do not wish to be confrontational. Also, they wish to cooperate with China whenever possible. As the business community looks at this situation, I think that we have a few reasonable goals and objectives. We want more stability. Confrontation should be minimized. National security should not be used as an excuse for protectionism. Supply chains should be efficient, stable, and flexible. And if supply chains need to be moved, government actions should focus on incentives rather than tariffs. Government action should be transparent and predictable. China should address its market access barriers. China should rely on the market as a decisive factor rather than constantly strengthening the party and the state. The lack of a level playing field in China must be addressed. And in general, free markets are good, trade is good, foreign direct investment is good. Both governments' articulation of these simple economic facts would be helpful. So while the Biden team's trade policy towards China has not really fully come together, I would advise the Biden administration to approach China with a three-part plan: short-term, medium, and long-term. In the short term, I would advise both governments to please keep the Phase 1 agreement and implement it fully. It is valid for another year. Now, this sounds easy, but the Chinese side has a lot of catching up to do if it is fully to meet its commitments under the Phase 1 agreement. But within that period, the two governments should negotiate a Phase 2 agreement with building in the advances made in the EU agreement, some of the residuals from the May 2019 agreement, and of course, utilizing the previous agreements under the BIT negotiations, which were never quite fulfilled. This should be accompanied by a removal or certainly a reduction of all the tariffs and the counter tariffs. I hope that a deal can be reached in principle by the time of the G20 in Italy on October 30th, or at the APEC summit in New Zealand on November 8th. Following successful completion of the Phase 2 agreement, both sides should enter into continued negotiations based on the CPTPP vocabulary, values, norms, and rules to complete a longer-term agreement that may lead to a WTO plus type of agreement to be adopted at the global level, possibly. I am happy to discuss any of these proposals further, but let me just say a bit more about the CPTPP, a subject that some might find obscure, but it is also very important. It is true that President Trump withdrew from CPTPP in 2017, and this is generally recognized as a strategic blunder. But the past is past, and there are no do-overs in life and in politics. At the same time, President Trump adopted most of the CPTPP rules, regulations when he abolished NAFTA and adopted the USMCA. USMCA was a modernization of NAFTA, but it is based almost entirely on CPTPP. So it should not be too difficult a lift for the US to rejoin the agreement, politics notwithstanding. The politics of this are too difficult for 2021 and maybe 2022, but after 2 or 3 years, we could certainly move in that direction. Now, Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang have both said that China wishes to join the CPTPP as well. This is an excellent idea from a strict economic perspective. It clearly will facilitate China's next stage of economic development. However, I do not think it will be easy, and these negotiations are going to take at least a few years. Both China and the US should express interest in joining CPTPP, and that would be an extremely ambitious undertaking. However, in a 3 or 4 year time frame, it is not impossible, and it could deliver great benefits. So I think that it is helpful for the US and China to use the CPTPP vocabulary, norms, and agenda to shape the bilateral discussions going forward. The discussion would inform and contribute to the global trade reform agenda. So in conclusion, it would be economically very beneficial for either country to join the CPTPP. It would be best, however, if both countries joined the CPTPP and use the CPTPP as a new paradigm for trade and investment regionally and globally. Let me conclude by saying that most normal people, unlike me, are not fixated or perhaps obsessed by trade or economic policy. I understand that there are many other important issues in the relationship. Now, while that's true, I would argue that if we are to find, if we do not find a modus vivendi on trade and economics, we will never be able to address those other issues. Economics is a foundation. And if that foundation is not sound, the entire edifice is unsound. And that is not something we should allow. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. I now want to turn to Minister Long, who, among other things, was China's chief negotiator on its WTO accession, and so probably has some expertise and points of view to share with us on these very important issues. Over to you, Minister Long. And you are on mute, so can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, you can hear me? Okay. Dear colleagues and friends, I'm so delighted to participate in this China-US relationships dialogue and have the opportunity to see so many old friends. As a matter of fact, I was involved in the China-US relationship for almost 3 decades, from late 70s to the early part of this century. And basically, within the framework of multilateral system, firstly, within the framework of the United Nations, I was a diplomat of China in New York as a member of the permanent mission to United Nations, and then seconded to UN Development Program as an international staff. And I could say I had a very, very pleasant experience in UN with our American colleagues. I still remember my first boss in UNDP, the administrator is from the United States, Bradford Morse. He was so kind to me as well as to China. He insisted very much that China should be one of the recipients of the United Nations Development Program. And he said, without China, UN Development Program is not complete. And he himself, I was very, very touched, get me to the United Nations Development Program and work as a staff. In his word, with the Chinese in my organization, we could better understand China and China can better understand the United Nations. So that is my experience in UNDP. And from 90s, last century, I became the chief negotiator of China to get China into WTO. I had numerous discussions with our American colleagues, and because American administrations change, and so I survived many chief negotiators from the US side. So I worked with American colleagues for more than 10 years. And instead of many difficult times I had with my American colleagues, but I have to say, and also it's fair to say, that United States made a very important contribution to get China back to the multilateral system in trade. And as a matter of fact, basically, we have been following the roadmap prepared by US side to get into this organization. So China get back to the multilateral system has brought tremendous benefit to the Chinese people, but also it's fair to say it also brought tremendous benefit to the world, including the United States. So today I have to emphasize that when we're talking about the China-US relationship, it is very important for these two countries to work together constructively within the framework of multilateral system. Because I have a firm belief that President Biden is welcome the opportunities to work in the multilateral system. I'm very pleased to know that after President Biden's conversation with the French leader, the White House issued a statement saying that leaders unanimously recognize that it is necessary to confront the common challenges of the world through such a mechanism of multilateral organizations. I think this statement make me very, very happy and make me very excited. Seems to me that bilateralism could bring a lot of good benefit to the US-China relationship. Number one, within the bilateral framework, the two countries can find many, many common ground to cooperate, to support each other, and to do some very constructive work instead of only focusing on some difficult issues of the bilateral natures. So as previous speaker said, we have a lot of things in common to work together in such areas as climate change and many, many other areas. So multilateral framework could bring a much broader perspective for China and the US to work together. And secondly, within the framework of multilateralism, US and China can find some common rules and common ground to work on. And so to enable to establish the China-US relationship on the basis of rule of law instead of rule of jungle. That's very important. Without the rules, there's no prediction and there's no stabilities. And thirdly, I believe that the multilateral framework could provide a very useful buffer when the two countries could sometimes experience very difficult time and confront very difficult issues. And multilateral framework can provide that kind of buffer so as to avoid direct confrontation of two countries. I think that's very important. I think in the immediate future, the two countries in the framework of multilateralism can do two important things. Number one, two countries can work together to accelerate the reform of World Trade Organization. As you know, that World Trade Organization is in a very difficult time, marginalized, and could hardly play any role now. Now, China and the United States are two important members of WTO. If China and the United States can work together, and we think that that could accelerate the reform of the WTO. The acceleration of WTO's reform could be very, very useful for this world of disorder. It could bring a lot of benefit to not only developing countries, but also to such big economies like the United States and China. And secondly, I believe that China and United States can work together to strengthen the regional free trade arrangements in Asia and the Pacific. And so, as you know, that last 15th of November of last year, the 15 countries of Asian Pacific declared the agreement of declared the reachment of an agreement called RCEP. As that's a very important milestone for Asian Pacific regional free trade arrangement. Unfortunately, US is not part of it. So we hope that the US in the future could be part of this regional arrangement. And also, as Craig Allen said, CPTPP could be also some things that China and the US could work together. The Chinese government has made it very clear it will consider very favorably to negotiate to get into CPTPP. I think that's a very, very important and constructive step for China to strengthen the regional free trade arrangements in Asian Pacific. United States, as a matter of fact, is the founding member of TPP, and we really hope that U.S. could also come back to CPTPP together with China. If CPTPP could have China and the United States both in CPTPP, that could be a real major step to reestablish the regional arrangement in Asia and Pacific. As you know now, the region, Asian Pacific is becoming more and more important in the world economical development. We really hope US, China can work together in this region. And if these two countries work together, the free trade arrangement in this region will be established and will contribute to the global prosperity and development. So I really hope that our two sides could work together within the framework of the multilateralism, not only at the global level, but also at the regional level. I think that's very, very important for both of us. And also, I believe, through my experience working with multilateral organization, I firmly believe multilateralism. This is what I believe. I'm so happy President Biden also thinks the same way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister Leung, for those remarks. And I do think that the issue of multilateralism is something that both sides are talking about, and it would be interesting perhaps in the Q&A to explore if we mean the same thing. And also, of course, the multilateral system is shifting and changing while we're also trying to engage it. So I think it's a very fundamentally important question. So thank you for your comments. We're going to now turn to the next of the topics, which is looking at and exploring the civic or people-to-people engagement between China and the United States, not only its past achievements, but also its future adjustments. And for this, we're going to hear from Dan Wright, who is the president and CEO of the Greenpoint Group, but also has a long professional and personal history on the people-to-people exchanges with China, between China and the United States, and Ambassador Zhou Wanzhong, who is the vice president of the China-U.S. People's Friendship Association and a former ambassador to the United States. And I'd like to start with Dan first, and then we'll move on to Ambassador Zhou. So Dan, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. This is such an important time to come together. We live in a season of significant disruption and change, not just in the bilateral relationship, but globally as well. The work of our organizers has never been more important. In 1978, Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping made a decision to send 3,000 students and scholars overseas. Later that year, US President Jimmy Carter famously said, "Tell him to send 100,000. The initial group of 52 scholars left China for the US in December 1978. In the next year, 8 American students went to China. During that period of time, I was a high school student in Atlanta, Georgia. Our church was across the street from Georgia Tech, just 3 miles from today's Carter Center, and provided free English tutoring to those students and scholars from China. I volunteered. This was the deal. I would teach English for free, and my new Chinese friends would reward me with homemade Chinese food and chopstick lessons. I still remember trying to pick up those slippery peanuts with my chopsticks. Since then, I've used those chopstick skills across the regions of China where I've lived, from Shanghai to Beijing to Nanjing and even Guizhou. Today, I've been asked to talk about education and culture relations over the last 4 decades, to review achievements, what has worked, and to reflect on lessons that can inform decision makers in the coming years. Here's my bottom line. During a time of increasing global disruption and bilateral tension, we must actually strengthen the foundation of the relationship, which is our people. We best do this by increasing people-to-people ties and educational exchange. Rather than tightening, we must further open. The world's emergence out of COVID will provide an excellent opportunity for all of us to recommit to this. This is the pragmatic, strategic choice we must make. I have three brief observations to share. First, about our achievements. The numbers, like other parts of the relationship, are clear and amazing. In the 2018 and 19 school year, the number of higher education students from China in US was about 370,000, comprising 1/3 of the 1 million international students in the United States. And over the past 40 years, nearly 330,000 American students have studied in China. Many of us participating in this event are included in those numbers. But you and I are more than just numbers, aren't we? More important than student flow statistics are the ideas, the insights, the trust, and personal growth that have resulted from exchange. The key achievement here has to do with the difference between information and understanding. These are not equal. Information is facts and data. You can find those online. Understanding is nuance and insight, which assists decision-making, judgment, and effectiveness. We live in an information age where we have an abundance of information about each other, but an increasing deficit in understanding. Information without understanding can be dangerous. The most effective way to move from information towards understanding is through interaction with people and firsthand experience. This is what happens in education and people-to-people exchange. As Doak Barnett, Bao, an American scholar who was born and raised in China and spent his entire professional career focused on the country, wrote in the preface of his book, China's Far West, back in the 1980s, he said, "One must be extremely wary of generalizations about China that are not rooted, at least partially, in study, observation, and experience at the grassroots level. Unfortunately, the images of China prevalent in the West have too often lacked such a basis." This is still true today, and I would argue that this is just as true for China's need to understand the United States, especially during this time of turbulent change. My second observation regards what has worked. Most fundamentally, openness and practical policies that support the movement of people and ideas are the keys to what has worked. Openness is better than closedness because it supports the flow of people and promotes the mutual understanding I've been describing. Both China and the US know from our own histories that great, confident countries tend to be more open. We have flourished when we have been most open. Fearful, insecure countries tend to be more closed. They do not prosper over time. So after COVID lets up, I recommend we redouble our efforts to strengthen openness, especially where it has to do with education and cultural and civic exchange. My final observation has to do with lessons for the future. So my point is we have to protect and advance the flow of people. As the US-China bilateral relationship appears to be becoming more competitive and in some areas more contentious, there will be pressure for this space to tighten. We will need to choose strategic oases, luzhou, in our relationship, areas that can promote understanding and that set a floor in our relationship. To do this, I have a couple practical suggestions, first from the top down and a few for the bottom up. We'll need to create a supportive environment. We will need high-level political signaling and support for education and cultural exchange, like when President Xi visited high school students in Chicago, or a few years after that in Tacoma, and when then Vice President Joe Biden played basketball with students outside of Chengdu. In addition, let's make sure a new high-level dialogue mechanism like the SED affirms the importance of people-to-people exchange. I hope that both governments will reconstitute such a mechanism. And we will need practical policy support that facilitates openness for travel, study, and research. And visa policy will be at the center of this. And on the other side, from bottom up, we need to strengthen exchange at local levels in both countries. University programs, mayors, governors, communities, and nonprofits. I'm on the board of the United States Heartland China Association. We're seeing an incredible appetite to engage at the local levels. This needs to be encouraged and supported. We need to promote more areas of practical cooperation at local levels to make specific the broad area talking about it at the national level, areas of climate change, public health, education, and commerce. And we need more events like this that promote and educate the general public. Going forward, it's going to be very important that the general populations in both the United States and China understand that the relationship can work to their benefit. In closing, given that public opinion in both countries is in a difficult place, that's what our populations are reflecting to us. This will not be easy, but it is essential. I suggest we use a clear-eyed, pragmatic approach. Our people make up the foundation of getting the relationship right, not simply because it's nice, but because it's necessary. Preserving, protecting, and advancing education and people-to-people ties will become increasingly important. Thank you, and I'll turn it back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Dan, and really thank you for those observations, particularly the difference between information and understanding. You know, I'm a product of people-to-people exchange, and you know that mutual understanding is a hugely difficult thing to achieve, but it's so important and that we all persevere. So thank you for those observations. And now I'd like to turn to Ambassador Zhou Wenzhong for his comments on this same topic. Ambassador Zhou.
Thank you. Good morning or good evening to everyone here. I think everyone here hopes that the U.S.-China relations will be able to take a turn for the better. But unfortunately, exchanges between China and the United States in recent years decreased or even stopped, including in the area of people-to-people exchanges. This is because of the wrong policy taken by the previous administration. They viewed China as the biggest competitor or even the so-called biggest threat. By doing so, the previous administration made a fundamental directional and a strategic mistake. China has no intention to challenge or replace the United States, and it respects U.S. legitimate interests in this region. China's policy towards the United States is stable and consistent. We believe that with deeply interwoven interests, neither country can do without the other, remodel the other, or replace the other. China and the United States can very well achieve common development side by side and work together to make great things happen for the two countries and the entire world. So what we need to do is now to find the right approach of engagement.
We seem to have a connection problem.
Need to move on to the next pair?
Yep. Okay, I will do that. So while we wait for Ambassador Zhou to be reconnected, we're going to move on to this last pair, who will be talking about mechanisms for risk management in the relationship, which I think, based on everything that we've heard today, are going to be pretty important going forward. And the two speakers will be Mike Lampton, who is the former He's a professor emeritus of China Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS and a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins. And he'll be joined by Dr. Zhu Feng, who is a professor of international relations at Nanjing University. And we'll start with Mike, and then Ambassador Joe, when you can sign back on, we'll bring you into the discussion. So Mike, please. And Mike, you're on mute.
Clear now? Good to be with you all. I want to thank all of the sponsors. And I would ask that Barbara Smith please give, I think, all of our highest respects to President and Mrs. Carter. I think we all owe virtually, at least on the American side, our careers and the 40 years of peace that we've enjoyed to President Carter and his colleagues, and of course, Deng Xiaoping and many others on the Chinese side. So please convey our highest respects to the president. I guess I would start out by saying I think our current moment requires honesty. In a way, I think the best friends of the relationship are the ones who can talk most frankly, and I think we all share a similar objective here. So please forgive my frankness. I think that there are sort of three backgrounds to this topic of risk management and how we move forward in a constructive way. But I think we have to probably be clear about three assumptions. One is that former President Trump got 74 million votes in our election. And whether Trump is in office or not, Trumpism persists. This is a very real force in our politics that, at least from my perspective, you can't wish away. So this is not going to be an overnight solution or overnight progress or easy restoration of some status quo ante before the Trump era ever began. That'd be the first thing I would say. Secondly, I think President Biden, as Ambassador Bacchus pointed out, really does wish to cooperate on solving global issues. I heard a statement by the administration today that issues, in particular climate change, is the core of our national security concerns. I was actually quite surprised how starkly and centrally that issue was placed on the security agenda. So I think he is very sincere about cooperation in proliferation, in health, climate issues, and so on, global economic management. So I think there's full acceptance of at least that there are cooperative dimensions to our relationship, and they are important. But at that first factor, that our domestic politics is headed in a somewhat different direction, at least for 74 million of our voters in this country. A third background fact for me is that China is increasingly confident. China, it seems to me, needs to manage its expectations and be careful. I remember for so many decades, my Chinese friends said, be patient. We're changing, but be patient. Well, I guess I would reverse that advice for my Chinese friends to the maximum degree that you can do that. Now, what I'd like to do is talk about what I think is a central challenge in our relationship and what we might do about that to some extent, and also what I see as a central opportunity. So, big problem, opportunity. I think if you think about it, we are in a period now rather like, I don't want to say a new Cold War. I'm not trying to really make that point. But if we think about the last Cold War and ask ourselves in terms of on the ground, where did we have problems? And the answer in geographic terms is all around the periphery of China. It was Korea. It was Vietnam. It was during the Cultural Revolution in Hong Kong. We even had problems in Xinjiang, inaccessible as it was for Americans. Tibet, the Indian border. And what we see once again is our bilateral relationships deteriorating. The conflict level in almost all of China's periphery is going up. Now that, if there's conflict on China's periphery, that's going to draw the U.S. in, and it's obviously going to be involve China as well. So I think we have to think about how we're going to manage all these problems along China's 360-degree periphery. That's a lot of problems. And a lot of people are talking about competition, but speak of competition in a kind of benign way. All I would point out is in history, there's no such thing as benign competition on China's periphery. So we've got to manage it. And so how are we going to manage this zone, this rift zone that we confront? And I think we need to, as rapidly as we can, and that means in the first year, restore strategically oriented dialogue. And with all deference to the important SED and SED, all the various versions of dialogue, I think we had a lot of dialogues, but maybe we need fewer involving more intense, more strategic discussion on a frequent basis. In other words, better, not necessarily more, and in the right area. So I think that we need to also develop crisis management. Not only is Taiwan, could it rapidly escalate, but the Korean Peninsula could, the South China Sea could, even the East China Sea. So I think we need to redouble our efforts to create crisis management kinds of mechanisms, and to do so sooner rather than later. Now, in terms of the opportunity, and I'll just wind up, but of course, we're all products of our history. I think one of the most formative things that happened to me is that in 1979, I went to China with then our Health, Education, and Welfare Secretary, Mr. Califano. And we signed 2 agreements because in our bureaucracy, health and education at that time were in the same bureaucracy. They were 2 different bureaucracies in China, hence we signed 2 agreements. But the point is, those 2 agreements still provide the framework for our cooperation in health and education. And I would like to see us, and this is just my proposal, not necessarily endorsed by anybody else, but I don't see why we don't get, maybe China sends its education secretary to the US, we send our health and human services to China. I don't care which one goes each way, but we really need to get serious about restoring this. And I hope that China will be receptive to the US getting its CDC personnel back in China. I hope China will be helpful as it can possibly be to this WHO team that's in China. I know it's sensitive, but we've cooperated on viruses before, as we did in 2013 in the Ebola, and there's absolutely no reason we can't cooperate again. So I guess what I would say is let's get management mechanisms in place for our strategic, well, let's say that rift zone all around China's periphery. Let's be very careful on managing those issues. And then let's move ahead vigorously. You know, our presidents may not, they may endorse it, but not necessarily very soon travel to each other's countries. But we can certainly get our secretaries and our ministers moving back and forth. And I would urge that at the earliest possible moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for your honesty as always, and some really concrete ideas that I hope we can all take on board. I want to see if Professor Zhu doesn't mind, I want to see if we can go back to Ambassador Zhou so that he can conclude his remarks, and then we'll come back to Professor Zhu. Ambassador Zhou, would you like to continue?
Yeah, I will be brief. I think we need to take a balanced view with regard to U.S.-China relations. And the relations have come a long way. And we should not really put too much emphasis on the negative side of the relationship because doesn't square with facts. You know, trade between China and the United States soared 200 times compared to the early days of diplomatic ties. And the two-way investment surged from negligible levels to almost $240 billion. In 2020, U.S.-China trade in goods grew by 8.8%, despite the COVID-19 pandemic and the political headwinds. And from Hurricane Katrina in 2005 to Wenchuan earthquake in 2008, Chinese and American people have extended each other a helping hand in times of need. When COVID-19 struck, the various sectors of our two societies also came to each other's aid, and China has provided a large number of medical supplies to the U.S. side. And that can go on, and China and U.S. have also maintained close communication and cooperation on regional hotspot issues, such as the Korean Peninsula, Afghanistan, and the Middle East, and carried out productive cooperation on counterterrorism, non-proliferation, anti-narcotics, and so on and so forth. So I think what we need to do next is to find, again, I emphasize, to find the right approach of engagement between the two major countries. And the goal of China-US engagement is not to mold the other in one's own image, still less to defeat the other side, but to seek and expand common interests. And that's exactly where the previous administration went wrong in their policies. So I have 5 suggestions. I'll be brief, just mention the central point of it. First, that's rebuilding the strategic framework for the stable growth of U.S.-China relations. Second, opening up dialogue exchanges at all levels and in all areas. Third, properly managing differences. Fourth, expanding practical cooperation and convergence of interests. I think right now, the sort of COVID-19 continues to spread across the world. So it is important for China and the United States to cooperate on the sharing of diagnostics and therapeutics, production of PPEs, development of effective medicine, and R&D and distribution of vaccines in an effort to jointly defeat the virus. And lastly, strengthening communication and coordination on regional and international issues. And these suggestions, of course, are very abstract. So we need to fill them up in details. But I think the most important point I want to make is your perception of China. So I hope you will continue to see China as a partner rather than a rival or even enemy. So this is the root cause of all the troubles we went through or we have gone through in recent years. So it's up to the new administration to make a decision in their perception of China, whether you see China as a friend, as a partner, or as a rival or enemy.
Thank you, Ambassador Zhou. I think you rival Professor Lampton with honesty, so it was really very refreshing, and thank you so much for those comments. I'm now going to turn to Professor Zhu Feng, and I will say that when Professor Zhu is finished, we'll have a few minutes for the panel to ask each other questions before we turn it over to audience questions. So as Professor Zhu is making his comments, if any of the panelists can think of questions, please raise your hand in the chat room if you can, and we will have a short period of time to facilitate that discussion. So now I'm going to turn to Professor Zhu.
Thank you, Liz. It's my big honor to join such a distinguished panelist on such a very, very timely moment for all bilateral relations. I learned a lot from all distinguished panelists' presentation, and I'm particularly grateful to President Carter's leader. I think his insights and enthusiasm is always enlightening force for the Chinese people, as well as the American colleagues. Let me just start my presentation from my observations to our relations. First, how the crisis management could just go very, very, we say, constructively. It's now one of the formidable tests for bilateral relations. I think one of the big, disruptive effects by the President Trump was almost suspension of all levels of the context and dialogue. So then we will see, no matter how we agree or disagree, then there's no channel to bridge the both sides. On the other hand, also just keep the two parts farther, we say, apart. So then a lot of suspicion, a lot of anxieties just emerging, and also get our relations is just escalating into some sort of a new conflict. But the problem is how such a crisis management could just achieved in a reasonable way. I think there's three basic points probably could be underlining some sort of return of the crisis management. First, I think let's get to the adequacy of diagnosing what's a real concern on both sides. For example, recently, even Mr. Blinken also agreed with the former Secretary of State Pompeo on the China's action until Xinjiang as some sort of genocide. To be honest, it's really, really just overblowing the Chinese scholars just like me, how to have such a historical comparison. We know that genocide is Nazis, some sort of brutality for some sort of such a killing Jewish people in an organized way. But if we get to the Xinjiang, then we will see it's the Chinese soft push, to be honest, in such a Chinese name, for fighting against Xinjiang's, separatists and extremism. So then today, even after the Capitol Hill storming, the Biden administration is considering the new legislation on domestic terror and domestic terrorism. So then I see there's quite a little difference between some sort of a new legislative impulse and China's actions in Xinjiang. We needed to fight against such extremism in a very, very formidable and effective way. So naming Xinjiang as action by the Chinese government as a genocide, to be honest, you are killing all the Chinese. Then second, I also see, for example, so then domestic politics, and it's also very disturbing effects to our relations. Then Trump administration is populist, is anti-globalist, and is white supremacist. So against this backdrop, I see the leading some sort of variable to turning our relations getting so worse is not China's change, is Americans' domestic politics change. Yes, you could have a lot of a complaint. Today, the Xi's administration's China has no heeding and biting anymore. But the problem is, I also see the power gap between Washington and Beijing remain very intact. I also see, yes, China's some sort of a new great power aspiration, while not just turning China into a revisionist power. It's totally different. But the problem is, why the policy narrative just going so worse? For example, under Trump, what's the China? China is theft, China is exploiter, China is some sort of people who desperately making advantage of Americans' market openness. So today, after such 4 years of such a deterioration of our policy narrative from the Trump administration, now public narrative in the US toward China also has never been worse. So then, if the crisis management could just going along in some sort of expected way, we needed to distance ourselves from current very disturbing domestic political disruption to both sides. I think it's very important. On the other hand, if we just always get our relations highly hijacked by the domestic politics in the US and as well as in China, then it's truly worrisome for how and where our relations will be heading on. So last point I want to say is, yes, it's not easy to change the public narrative in the US, but the problem is, at least, I think that both governments and both society should recognize against this very special moment, the power should be sparingly and strategically used. For example, Taiwan issue, probably it will be new fresh points. But from my perspective, neither of sides, Washington and Beijing, really want to push the envelope to get the Taiwan issue become some sort of a new explosive device for both sides? No way. I see there's no strategic imperative for both sides to just overplay the Taiwan factor. So then the problem is, it's now some sort of a very, very important test for Washington and Beijing. We should use the power sparingly and strategically. So finally, let me come to my conclusion. Our bilateral relations has never been worse on all the fronts, but most important is don't let some sort of simmering domestic political transition really become a new formidable threat to our relations. My generation of Chinese get a lot of illumination from Americans. Today, most of the Chinese also still believe what the US could serve to redirect China into the better off. You are the beacon. Never get your beacon eclipse. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zhu. I am afraid that we aren't actually going to have time for a discussion among the panelists themselves because there are questions piling up in the Q&A box, and I do want to hand over to Madam Su Xiaohui to manage the audience Q&A session. And I just want to try to summarize what has been an incredibly rich and robust discussion by one observation, which we started with a letter from President Carter, and we've referenced back to those important historic moments in the beginning of the normalization of relations between China and the United States. And really, if we look back, that was a simpler time. It seemed like a really, really hard decision to take at that time, and it was. But when we look at what the relationship has become, it is both more complex and more robust, and therefore deeply meaningful and full of potential. But at the same time, it is more complex. There are more issues to be managed simultaneously than ever before. And I think that's the mark of a mature international relationship, but it does mean that we have to be really paying attention and careful about it. And the complexity is not just geopolitical, but as many people have mentioned, both countries have domestic politics that are also important to consider and that are having an impact on the way the elite politics happens between the two countries. And finally, I just would like to observe that solving this and managing the US-China relations is both a top-down elite political question that needs to be addressed with responsibility, and it's undergirded by an important and fundamental bottom-up grassroots and civic cultural engagement that also needs to exist at the same time. So with that, I now want to turn over to Madam Su Xiaohui for her to manage and moderate the Q&A session with the audience. So Madam Xu, over to you.
Thanks, and good morning and good evening to everybody. I'm Su Xiaohui from China Institute of International Studies, a think tank based in Beijing. I suppose most of the panelists or all the panelists today have been to CIS. We have a nice garden. And talking about major power relationship, and I always believe that it is unlikely for the two sides to see totally eye to each other, but they can tango. It takes two to tango. The willingness for tango is quite important. And the webinar today provides a platform for tango. We have encountered insightful speeches and brilliant points. I collected some questions during the registration process and during the speeches. But first of all, I would take the liberty of my role as the moderator to raise my own question first. And lately, as we noticed that the White House press secretary said that the United States is starting from approach of patience in its relations with China. I noticed that in December last year, Biden's nominee for Defense Secretary, the retired General Austin, talked about patience towards China. It was interesting that he was simultaneously praised and criticized by proposing the idea. So my question is, what does patience mean for the relationship from the US perspective? Please, Dr.
Maybe I'll take a shot at that. Can people hear? Yeah. First of all, I don't speak for the administration, and I would ask myself in some sense this same question. But I guess, first of all, as I said in my remarks, I think the U.S. needs to itself be patient because its primary objectives are on the domestic side and the pandemic and restoration of our economy. And indeed, the first time I think I've ever said this in a discussion with Chinese, we're concerned about domestic stability in some fundamental ways. So in a sense, we're saying, let's not elevate China and the problems we have with China so high that it's unrecognizable given all our domestic problems. Remember, Deng Xiaoping essentially wanted, for many reasons, to improve relations with the US, but not least so he could deal with China's sizable development problems, internal problems after the Cultural Revolution. Well, our situations aren't analogous, but they're similar. Also, I wouldn't presume to speak for the administration, but I think we hope that you will be patient in dealing with some of these issues that we know are very sensitive to you. Certainly, the Taiwan issue has been mentioned a couple of times, but also your problems with Japan. Also, hope you're patient with respect to India. So the way I would choose to understand this word patient is maybe we both need to be patient with each other.
Thanks, Dr. Lampton, and it was quite insightful. And actually, for the Chinese people, I suppose that a lot of people are waiting for the US side to send out clear signal to the Chinese side that we can move on. Well, I noticed that Ambassador Zhou and Zhong raised your hands. Please go ahead.
It's not enough. I know Professor Graham Allison came up with 5R. So I would like to quote him. He says, first R, that's return to the normal. Second R is reversal. That's reverse the mistakes. Third R is review the policies. Fourth R is realism. And the fifth R is responsible. So I think you need to do all these things, not just patient.
Good point. So let's move to the topic for the dialogue. I noticed that a lot of audience raised the questions about the dialogues between the two sides. There's a question: how can the two sides talk to each other properly rather than making dialogues between the depths? Please, Mr. Wright.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really important question. I think we all would generally agree that dialogue is important. I had the privilege of working under Secretary Paulson in the very early one, the Strategic Economic Dialogue, and Ambassador Zhou was a very strong partner for us at that time. First of all, we should not underestimate the value of dialogue. Talking actually is important. Relationship is important on its own. It's not empty. That would be the first thing. Second of all, in a dialogue going forward, and Professor Lampton, I believe, mentioned this, I believe it needs to be smaller and meet more frequently at high levels. With all due respect to the S and ED, it did get, in my view, too large, and it became more of a process. It became more of an event than actually a process. So I think to affirm that dialogue is important at high levels, and then also that a dialogue going forward, the structure would be smaller and it would meet more frequently with very concrete outcomes that would be pursued.
Well, great. And shall we move? Please, Mr. Long Yuntu. You are on mute. Please, Mr. Long Yuntu, please. You are on mute.
Yeah, you can hear me. Yeah, okay. I think dialogue is very, very important. Through my experience dealing with American friends, I have a very important conclusion that sometimes we think that we have very, very critical differences, but those differences sometimes is not out of substance, but sometimes it's more out of misconception and misunderstanding. So if we have a very smooth and ready channel of dialogues, we can avoid a lot of misunderstanding and misconceptions. And then we meet with, sometimes we find the difference on substantive issues are not that big as we thought. So I believe that dialogue, communication, and a smooth and ready channel of communication is so important for two countries, because sometimes our difference is not as that we thought. We have to clarify many things and get to understand where is the misconceptions and the misunderstandings, and move those misconceptions, misunderstanding sometimes is more important to get down to the consensus. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Long Yuntu. So we will move to specific issues in China-US relationship. I remember Mr. Allen just talked about the economic cooperation between the two sides. You said that economics is the foundation. Without addressing this issue, it is unlikely for the two sides to resolve the issues of other perspectives. So I also collected some issues, questions about the economic relations between the two sides. Some audience was interested in how the two countries will address the economic relationship in Biden administration, especially for the fourth phase economic deal of the two countries, how the two countries will move forward. Mr. Allen?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that the Biden administration is carefully looking at its options, and also discussing with allies, friends and partners around the world, where collaboration might be a useful way forward. I very much appreciate Long Yongtu's commitment to multilateralism, principled multilateralism. And I think that you'll see a difference in the approach of the Biden administration towards the WTO and multilateral institutions, which I think we will all appreciate. At the same time, I am not certain that those institutions will be strong enough, fast enough to deal with 21st century issues such as the internet or data or genetic medicines and many other technology problems. So I think that we should all be grateful that Vice Premier Liu He and President Trump signed a phase one agreement about a year ago, and that agreement gives us a stepping stone, a foundation, a pathway forward. It's a good agreement, and it gives the two countries a way to discuss not only the trade issues, but other issues as well. And that foundation currently is more important than ever. And so I'm hopeful that the two governments will recommit to that agreement. The Chinese side will make the purchases that it committed to within the terms of the agreement, and that we could move forward. That is in the interest of both China and the United States. And I'm certain that it will contribute to sustainable Chinese economic growth in the months and years ahead. It is complementary to China's reform agenda and necessary for China to become a fully modern country and leap ahead of the middle income trap, which is a real danger. So we must move quickly on the economics, bilaterally, regionally, and multilaterally. All of those negotiating fora should be used to address the important economic issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. I was reminded that Professor Zhu Feng would like to propose a point previously. I'm sorry that I didn't notice you. I promised that I was a hardworking student in Peking University when I was in your class.
Yeah, thank you, Xiaohui. I want to get back to the strategic patience discussion a little bit. I think Professor Lambton made a great idea, great points. I totally agree, but I want to go a little bit further. For example, so I understand such a domestic turmoil usually will stop the Biden administration from just making a step quickly in the improvement of our bilateral relations. But the problem is, first of all, we have to just examine, for example, what kind of disastrous, the consequence the Trump administration left for bilateral relations. Then we will say, if we just look at what kind of such a damage Trump just created, then our bilateral relations now is just one step away from demolition. I'm sorry for using these words. Yes, it's just a comprehensive demolition of our bilateral relationships architecture. So then I really hope that either side, Washington and Beijing, could have some sort of strategic, imperative to just go beyond the Trump's very, very disastrous legacy and signaling unambiguously, both sides want to get the relationship warming up. I think such a signaling is not just some sort of political assurance, it's also a big push for new political willingness to get our relationship well salvaged. So that's why as long as strategic patience is always lingering, I'm afraid it's some sort of consequence to our relations will be still very, very negative. And even just interpreted on the Chinese side as Biden's, political nudging, political dodging from any just improvement of our relations. So then I really hope strategic patience could be taken more seriously. And then we can also should have a parallel to signaling positively and productively.
Thank you, Professor Zhu Feng. You expressed, I believe, the conception or the ideas from Chinese scholars that we are concerned about China-US relationship, and we really need some positive signals from both sides to make good things happen. And here's a question specifically for Dr. Lampton. Dr. Lampton, your proposal for the reconceptualization of the bilateral education relations is spot on from the audience. Well, actually, I attended the program called AVLP in 2015, the International Visitor Leadership Program. I heard from the staff of the US Embassy in Beijing that the program is still working. But for the Fulbright, it seems that the program was cut off by Trump administration. So there was a lot of concern from Chinese students and scholars that whether the education or cultural exchange or the academic exchange from the two sides is still working. Will there be more obstacles for the two sides to conduct exchanges, or will there be more support from Biden administration to further the exchanges from the two sides?
Well, I should make it clear. I always want to make it clear. I'm just giving my own views and not that of the administration. So if you'll accept my views as my views, I'll give those to you. On the Fulbright program, I think that was a blunder by the previous administration. And I can't, as I say, speak for the administration, but I think there's widespread support to get that kind of thing restarted. And I would ask you a very pointed question, however. If the US proposes to restart it, will China agree? There has been some, as I would see as an outsider, distrust of US educational programs that involve wide dissemination of American ideas in China. So I wonder if in some sense we ended a program that isn't 100% supported in China. I think if I would end, and I would think, I know in American academia and the American research community, that would be, I think, close to universally supported. Nothing's 100%, but would enjoy widespread support. But will China agree? So that in that area, I think I would have a question for you as well as you have one for us. But I hope that's an early area that we move ahead on. In terms of other problems in the education area, I think this whole question of research universities, intellectual property, so-called, well, I'll give you an example. There's a recent case at MIT about a professor and the terms on which he was working with China's 1,000 Talents program. And it involves sizable amounts of money, and that case will work out in court. I have no opinion on the merits. But this whole issue of intellectual property protection and related security-related research and technology, I think that's getting to be a worse and worse problem. Also on the Confucius Institutes, there have been a substantial diminution of Confucius Institutes in the US. There are still quite a few institutions with it, but I don't think there's probably going to be a big appetite on American campuses now to at least create new relationships, partly because of potential funding consequences for research universities that are not mindful of U.S. government policy in the security area. So I think this strategic military conflict, all of this is spilling over into our educational relations. But I think there are some early opportunities, and I would hope the U.S. would move rapidly in consultations with China to renew the Fulbright program and welcome that. And I would add just one last thing, Professor Zhou Wenjun, you mentioned Graham Allison, and I think you said 6 R or 5 R's. Let me add a 6th R, reassurance. China needs to reassure its neighbors, because when your neighbors are reassured, we're reassured. So we can't, all these threads are intertwined, but I'd like to see us move ahead on this Fulbright program.
Thanks, Dr. Lampton. So let's keep our fingers crossed. Here's a couple of specific questions for Ambassador Cui. And people are interested in the high-level exchanges between the United States and China. So there has been questions talking about whether the two sides will carry out call conversation or high-level exchanges. Please, Ambassador Cui Tiankai.
Well, I can only say there is no discussion yet about such contact or communication between the two sides. You see, it's just been 1 week since President Biden came to office. Maybe we do need a little bit patience. And about the previous point, the Fulbright program, I think Professor Lampton was right to mention the Confucius Institute, what happened to Chinese scholars, even Chinese American professors. So you have to look at the whole thing together. It's just not the Fulbright program. It's a lot more other things.
Thank you, Ambassador Cui Tiankai. And we understand that there's a lot of agenda on Biden's table, and to address the domestic problems and to address some sensitive challenges domestically might be his priority in recent days. But there's still hope from Chinese side that both countries will try to reach out to each other to pave the way for communication. So this is the views from the academic fields in China to try to make good things happen between the two countries to stabilize the relationship, no matter it is patient or not. So let's move to other questions. There has been some questions talking about CPTPP. So I noticed that we have been discussing the U.S. attitude towards China's involvement or China's participation in the CPTPP. So is there any specific elaboration on the future of TPP and about the possibility of China's participation? Any panelists so make a prediction or not? Please, Mr. Long Yong-tu.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
We can.
Yeah. I'm almost the first person to be very positive about TPP at that time. At that time, within countries, there's a lot of voice very hostile to TPP. At that time, I already said that we should not do that way because TPP represents the future of the global rules of trade and investment. China should be part of the rules and also part of the process to formulate the future rules for trade investment. So I was very positive. And Then through efforts of many of my colleagues, my government also announced that we hope that TPP could be successful, and wish them well. And that is the position of the government at that time. When the Trump administration withdrew from the TPP, and Japan and some other countries followed by CPTPP, we also think that that's one of the important part of the Asian Pacific regional arrangements. So why should China take a negative or even hostile attitudes to them? So now you can see that the government of China officially announced its position to be positive to CPTPP, and also expressed the willingness to start the negotiations. As you know, that CPTPP is a very high-level free trade agreement, and including many of the rules which should be negotiated seriously by China and its participants. So I think we have to be prepared, firstly domestically in China, and have a careful study of what it means to Chinese industrial, agricultural, trade, investment. And because only by understanding the substance of the CPTPP, you could start the negotiation on the right direction. So in this connection, of course, I'm not speaking on behalf of my colleagues in the government, but I could only say that we are very, very seriously study CPTPP and prepare for the early negotiation to access to CPP. But it is also depend on the existing members of CPTPP to express their welcome for that kind of negotiation. I think it's a matter of both sides, and only both sides take a positive attitude. It could be reaching some concluding positive conclusion. But in this connection, I also believe that it needs some patience, and we're not in a rush to get into CPTPP. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Long Yongtu. I still remember before October 2015, when TPP was signed by the 12 countries, there has been intense discussion in China about whether we should try to reach out to TPP or not. Some people propose some positive ideas about TPP, and others believe that the TPP was negative for China's development and also negative for China's role in the region. But the key question is that whether China is ready to join TPP. So the readiness from China's side might be vital. And I would like to propose the last question, since time is running out. I will choose a kind of sensitive question from an audience. Here's a question talking about Taiwan issue. Taiwan seems to be the biggest risk in terms of a flashpoint. Can you comment on whether the initial framework in terms of the 3 communiques still exists in reality? Well, actually, Taiwan issue has been quite challenging for China-US relationship in Trump administration, especially in the last days. So there has been concerns from the Chinese side about whether the US will move forward, whether the United States will attach the right line or the bottom line of the relationship. So any idea from the panelists? Please, Professor Zhu Feng.
Yeah, I see one of the very I think ominous damages from the Trump administration was the White House and the Pentagon were just deliberately and desperately overplay the Taiwan cause. Then I also believe it's really, really hurting the China so much, because as you know, the Taiwan issue is highly political, And it's also has a big, association to the Chinese nationalistic sentiments. But the problem is the Trump administration kept, just a blurring some sort of, we say, one China policy, and it just overplayed around some sort of a bottom line. So then, since it's getting never been worse. So then, that's why I consider under Biden, the Taiwan issue should be left behind. Don't just overplay the Taiwan issue. Don't use the Taiwan as some sort of a new card strategically and politically to take the stab at the China. So then otherwise we will consider, since it's hard to control and manage. So then Taiwan issue, I think the Biden administration should supposedly and expectably just getting back to reconfirmation of 3 decades and other documents, embodied, the principle and putting the Beijing and the Washington closer.
Thank you, Professor Zhu Feng. So time is running out. I will leave the last few minutes for all the panelists to decide whether you will have one thing that is more important to say. So the last chance.
Let me make the additional point to the question about Taiwan. When the normalization took place, President Carter agreed to stop the sale of arms to Taiwan for 1 year. And then during Reagan administration, the issue came up again, because it's obviously wrong for a country which has a diplomatic relations with PRC, which continues to sell weapons to part of China. So that's why negotiations took place during Reagan administration. So August 17th joint communique, U.S. made a commitment, that is to gradually reduce the sale of arms to Taiwan until the final stoppage of the sale of weapons to Taiwan. But I think the U.S. did not live up to its commitment to August 17 joint communique, although the communique is still there, which I think the U.S. should do what it has made its commitment to. And during the Trump administration, I think they sold more than $13 billion of weapons to Taiwan. So I think this is really a very potential big problem between the relations between the two countries.
Thank you, Ambassador Zhou and Zhong. So is there any panelists that would like to propose your key points? Please, Dr. Lampton.
The question started out, are the 3 communiques still in effect? I think was the broad initial question. And I think the answer to that is yes. And I think that should remain the case, because frankly, we don't have an alternative structure, first of all. And so I would say they are in effect and should stay in effect. Where I see the change coming is, in some sense, Congress is more active. There are now 300 plus pieces of legislation and congressional activity resolutions working themselves through Congress. So Congress is much more active and is not controllable really by the administration in many respects. But where I see and this is me speaking personally, the change is in the U.S. 1994 guidelines. So it's sort of the way it's been explained, and that is how we implement and conduct the 3 communiques. What kinds of things would be seen to confer excessive officiality on Taiwan, and what other things would be more acceptable. And I think many of the changes you're seeing are really in how we're implementing or how we might implement things. And in this case, I would just personally encourage my government to be extremely careful. I think this is very, well, you would say Mingan, sensitive, but I don't think that really captures it. So until we've got an agreed upon replacement for 3 communiques, we've got that and it's a plausible basis, but we've got to be very careful how we implement this. And that's where I have concerns. But I would just, and this is to Ambassador Zhou's point. Yes, the weapons sales controversy he described under Reagan in '82 is absolutely correct. But the U.S. position was always premised on Taiwan being able to defend itself in a sense and not undue pressure from the PRC. But as you've modified, your PLA's become bigger, which is quite understandable. Of course, it's bigger for everybody, including Taiwan. So the growth of your military really was not anticipated to the degree that it's occurred so rapidly and effectively. And also, I mean, we have to be frank, China's putting more pressure on Taiwan. And of course, Taiwan's internal politics are changing in directions that are more worrisome to you. So I would say, you know, I urge my government to be careful, but I think you need to be careful. You should not assume the U.S. has so many problems. It would not choose to become more involved if peace broke down. So I think this is something that could go out of control very rapidly.
Thank you, Mr. Lambton. I noticed that Ambassador Cui Tiankai raised your hands, but we will go to Mr. Wright first and Ambassador Cui Tiankai for conclusion.
Okay. I'm happy to yield to Ambassador Cui, but we'll have Ambassador Cui conclude, I guess. Yeah, I want to come back to the importance of making sure the U.S.-China relationship works for the common people of the United States and China. I know it's challenging. I know much of the momentum is a different direction, but I do think that's an important work for both of our governments to be aware of, to figure out practical ways to do that. I think with the Biden administration, a new opportunity with the Xi administration, new opportunities to diligently explore how the bilateral works for the common people in both of our countries. So commercially, in the space of education and the area of people-to-people flows, which I talked about earlier. So I just wanted to really emphasize that point here at the end of the time. Thank you. Ambassador Cui.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I don't think I can offer any conclusion. Rather, I would like to raise some alarm. First, about this Taiwan issue, the 3 joint communiques. Of course, the 3 joint communiques provide the framework for us to manage this particular very important, very sensitive question. But when the US side refers to the 3 joint communiques, they always said, well, the 3 joint communiques and Taiwan Relations Act. Now they said the 3 joint communiques and Taiwan Relations and 6 assurances. I think this is very dangerous. If we go on like this, the 3 joint communiques will be diluted or even made empty words. That is very dangerous. Number 2, it's not only Taiwan. The list is getting longer and longer. You have Xinjiang, you have Hong Kong, you have Tibet, what else? So I have asked the Trump people when they were still running the State Department, I asked them, are you going to put all the Chinese provinces on the list? What is your real intention? What can people in China interpret all this? I think that the only conclusion is that the real intention of US policy is to dismantle China as a country. If that is the case, it's really dangerous. So I just want to raise some alarm.
Thank you, Ambassador Cui Tingkai. It is a real alarm. Actually, in Beijing, there has been discussions talking about the China-US relationship and talking about the sensitive issues like a Taiwan issue. It seems that the US government denied the official relationship with Taiwan clearly, but it seems to the audience, the people in Beijing, that we want the United States to carry out the one China policy in a sincere way. So time is really running out, so let's call it a day today. And thanks for the Carter Center and Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament for organizing this platform, for all the panelists to provide their insightful points and to exchange ideas. It takes two to tango, and I noticed that the willingness to tango today. So thank you for all the audience and the panelists for your insights.
Oh.
Thank you all. So
thank you very much.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Đúng rồi.
谢大使，谢谢你哈。谢谢你啊，苏晓慧。
谢谢刘老师。
谢谢老师。
我们到时候我不知道你们那边有没有这个，我们可能会把它文字弄出来以后会发给每个发言人，最后要这个今天算是 on the record。